1 minute.
I'll keep after him. Okay, if everybody can please take your seats, please go to your seats. Please go ahead and go to your seats and wonderful conversations. We'll have time for more conversation at lunchtime, so if you could please go ahead and take your seats. Thank you very much. Please go ahead, take your seats. Please go ahead and take your seats. Please return to your seats. Hello, please go ahead and sit down. Please go ahead and sit down. If everyone that's still standing will take a seat, please, if you will go ahead and take your seats. Hello. 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 Everyone that's still standing, please take your chairs. Everyone still standing, please take your chairs.
Thorough introductions from what we're given in the first panel, but I'll basically say everyone knows you. You're Executive Director of World Beyond War.
Please, everyone, go ahead and take your chairs. Everyone at the coffee pots, take your chairs. Everyone at the food place, take your chairs. Oh, no, let's not. Let's not. No, wait. It's taking apart. It's tearing apart here. Let's just not move it. Yeah, let's not move it. Everybody, please go ahead and take your
Sit down.
Don't do that. My apologies to David, for David. Please, everybody, go ahead and take your seats. You sounded like you're an Army First Sergeant. Everybody, please take your seats. Okay, anybody left standing, we'll ask you to go outside in the 100-degree heat and continue the conversation. Okay, everybody at the coffee pot, please go ahead and take your chairs. Okay, we're almost there. We thank you all so much. Everybody that's back by the bathroom, no more hugs. Let's come on in. Please have a seat. We'll have another break at lunchtime, and you can continue the wonderful conversations that you have with all of these great people. And let's give a big round of applause for our first panel. Wasn't that good? And another round of applause for our keynote speaker, Severin. Yay! Okay, before we start our second panel, we're going to have a little bit of music again, just to keep us going. So Ben, would you please come up? Ben Gossip from Western Mass.
I saw this lunatic in the kitchen with this weird red, white, and blue costume. I have no idea what was going on with that. My name's Ben Grosscup from Western Massachusetts. Song I want to sing for you comes from a melody from the African-American spiritual tradition, Joshua Fit the Battle of Jericho. But this song, friends, it says, "We say NATO's got to go." And I'm going to ask you to sing along with me, all right? Here we go. From Kosovo to Afghanistan to Libya and Ukraine, the bureaucrats of NATO bring endless war and pain. They say they want a victory, so they're sending in more arms. But nuclear Armageddon doesn't seem to raise alarm. We say NATO's got to go, got to go, got to go. We say NATO's got to go so the people can live in peace. We say NATO's got to go, got to go, got to go. We say NATO's got to go so the people can live in peace. Raytheon and Lockheed make the weapons used to kill. NATO members buy them, and the people pay the bill. We can't afford good housing. We can't afford health care. We can't afford clean water, 'cause NATO left us bare. Here we go. We say NATO's got to go, got to go, got to go. We say NATO's got so the people can live in peace. We say NATO's got to go, got to go, got to go. We say NATO's got to go so the people can live in peace. Washington made NATO to enforce its global rule. Now it's bombing pipelines where allies once got fuel. NATO domination brings hunger, war, and fear. But there's cracks in the foundation, and NATO's end is near. Remember what happened at Jericho? The trumpets began to sound. Joshua commanded the people to shout, and the walls came tumbling down. We say NATO's got to go, got to go, got to go. We say NATO's got to go so the people can live in peace. We say NATO's got to go, got to go, got to go. We say NATO's got to go so the people can live in peace. We say NATO's got to go, got to go, got to go. We say NATO's got to go so the people can live in peace. Thank you.
Thanks to Ben again. Yeah, thanks, Ben. That was really great. Another big round of applause for Ben Gossip. Okay, I'd like to introduce the moderator for our next panel. Thank you. Sean Connor is the Executive Director of the International Peace Bureau, the oldest peace organization in the world. So big hand for Sean Connor.
Thank you, and great. Thank you to everyone who has already spoken today. I think we're off to a great start, and we have another excellent panel here. So I'll just very briefly introduce our speakers for it and give the floor over to them. We have a few less speakers, so we will have some more time, hopefully also for some questions at the end. So first we have David Swanson, who I hope everyone here already knows of his great work. Of course, is one of the central organizers of this event today, the Executive Director of World Beyond War. We also have Alain Roy from Mouvement de la Paix, or Movement for Peace in France.
Motaz is 8 minutes away.
And Motaz Salim of Code Pink, Palestinian American, should be here within around 8 minutes. So he'll be joining us as soon as he arrives, and we'll bring him right to the stage and give him a nice welcome. The title of the panel now is is NATO and Wars. And of course, we know NATO is very clever about how it engages in wars, using the coverage of the UN, as we've heard, or having individual countries, despite all being NATO countries, engaged in war. So I think we're going to hear a lot more about how this plays out in practice, past, present, and future during this panel. So not to speak for too long here, I'll give the floor right over to David, please.
Thank you to Sean and to the International Peace Bureau, which also recently did a 24-hour peace wave together with World Beyond War and do wonderful work. This scarf, as I've been explaining to people around the room, the idea started in Afghanistan, a sky blue scarf. We all live under the same blue sky, and we don't want any wars under it. And they are out there in the lobby on the table, and take them if you want them. I'm very glad that Moataz will be here to focus on the topic of Gaza. The NATO of popular imagination is an assembly of representatives of democratic nations who commit to making the world more peaceful, including by militarily defending each other if one of them is attacked. There could hardly exist a more grave collection of lies. NATO is, in fact, an institution devoted primarily to the increased sale of weaponry to governments of every type. Neither its members nor its often openly dictatorial partners acting at the bidding of any populace, and devoted secondarily to doing the will of one government, that based right here in Washington, D.C., where Joe says he is running the world, and which is represented by over 900 military bases outside its borders. NATO's wars have never involved defending one of its members from a foreign invasion. Only once ever has NATO even claimed to be calling its members to collective defense, and that was for the idiotic, mass murderous, environmentally catastrophic, counterproductive on its own terms, 20-year war on the distant, impoverished nation of Afghanistan, waged principally for U.S. political reasons following terrorist attacks, even though terrorist attacks have not been used as a justification for NATO wars when they have happened in any other NATO member country, and waged by NATO only following the individual U.S. attack on Afghanistan that overthrew a government made up of people who, with a very few tweaks, would fit in very well a couple of blocks from right here on the U.S. Supreme Court. Every other NATO war has lacked even the ridiculous pretense of defensiveness, and often even any agreement among NATO members, so that one could debate what has or hasn't been a NATO war, were one to ignore the fact that the staff and the infrastructure of NATO have been used to launch or continue or escalate the wars on Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Ukraine, and Gaza. Not a single one of these has been legal, neither before nor during NATO involvement. NATO has no power to legalize anything. Even the NATO of popular imagination would be a criminal enterprise, even during a war of the popular imagination involving an angelically innocent nation invaded out of the blue by subhuman monsters. There is nothing in the UN Charter about Good Samaritan, mass murder machines joining in an authorized war. There is much in actual human history to suggest the value of negotiation, diplomacy, demilitarization, unarmed civilian defense, and an actual law-based order, and to suggest that these alternatives are damaged by heavy investment in institutions dedicated to the structures and the cultures that drive weapons sales. In Bosnia and Serbia, NATO first went to war and did so against a nation that had not attacked or even threatened any NATO member, and despite some NATO members wanting to work for peace. The U.S. went to war without approval from the UN or even from the U.S. Congress, but with the new law unto itself, NATO proclamation of humanitarian war. In the U.S. government, those wanting more wars had discovered that they could justify them by bringing vassal states along, like a shoplifter discovering that if he dragged along 10 buddies, then the cops would all help them fill their pockets. In Congress, it was discovered that particular horrors in wars wouldn't need to be investigated if they could be labeled as NATO's. And NATO doesn't have any government to investigate it because it's not a nation. It just plays one on TV, sending its unelected leader around the world to do joint press conferences with prime ministers and presidents. The biggest discovery, however, was that there needed to be no end of Cold War peace dividend. In fact, there needed to be no end to the Cold War. War, it was discovered, could be an endless humanitarian public service, fending off an array of ineliminable threats, from terrorists to pirates to China to Russia to various governments buying their weapons from the wrong places. Horrible governments, to be sure, but no more horrible than many of those buying their weapons from the right places. And of course, wars kill a lot more than governments, and generally do not kill governments at all. NATO's grandest accomplishment thus far is the destruction of Afghanistan, the deforestation and poisoning of the land, the killing of hundreds of thousands of people, the making homeless of millions, the diversion of trillions of badly needed dollars into massive devastation, and the defeat of the vast majority of the world's militaries by an impoverished and divided people reduced to stealing the invaders' equipment and selling the invaders' drugs to finance a successful resistance. Not to mention the propaganda accomplishment, which takes no notice of any of this reality, namely the merging of the criminal and nonsensical humanitarian war with the criminal and nonsensical war of revenge. In US culture, a war as horrific as that on Afghanistan can be transformed into a glowing model of goodness and wonder simply by launching another war that is even worse. Once the war on Iraq was despised enough to require people like Barack Obama to pretend to oppose it, the war on Afghanistan had to be a good war, in the manner in which World War II had become the ultimate good war during the war on Vietnam. And yet, quite shamelessly and openly, what makes Afghanistan a good war is in part that it was a war of revenge, a justification present in no law or treaty whatsoever, but absent from almost no Hollywood movie in my lifetime. Somebody had stepped out of line. Somebody had disrespected NATO and that little sliver of the world's population called the international community, and therefore the people who lived in a place those criminals had spent some time in needed to pay with their lives. And because the last moments of the war were as violent as the previous 20 years, the problem is now understood as not what the war did, but how it was ended, or even that it was ended. Of course, Tony Blair, humanitarian Middle East expert, had told George W. Bush, famous portrait painter and master's class instructor, that it would be okay to attack Iraq if they attacked Afghanistan first, because revenge. And attack Iraq they did without formal NATO involvement, which is part of what has left NATO with a reputation of being more law-abiding than your average Congress member. But NATO militaries were bullied into helping. And eventually Iraq became the site of a NATO training mission that was a little hard to distinguish from a US-led occupation, with the same US generals in charge of both things, and which persists in a newer version to this day, despite Iraqi demand for Nexit, if you will allow that word. In 2003, there were moves in a Belgian court to prosecute General Tommy Franks, thank you to our Belgians in the room, the commander of the US troops in Iraq, for using cluster bombs in civilian areas. US Secretary of so-called Defense Donald Rumsfeld dealt with that problem at a NATO meeting by warning Belgium that the US would not fund NATO's headquarters in Belgium and would not take part in meetings in Belgium, leaving the impression that NATO headquarters would be moved elsewhere. Instead of shouting, "Good riddance and take your illegal nuclear weapons with you," Belgium fell in line, a tool in the tools-based order. The prosecution quickly disappeared, while the war on Iraq rolled on unchanged. In 2011, NATO decided to attack Libya. It lied about threats to Libyans and pretended that a UN resolution on protecting Libyans was an authorization for a war, the bombing of the country, the overthrow of the government, leaving chaos and mountains of weapons spreading across the region for years afterwards, not to mention open-air slave markets. The excuse for the war was even called genocide prevention. This was back, remember, before genocide facilitation became the respectable order of the day on Capitol Hill. To its credit, the U.S. Congress, like the UN, like all laws and treaties, like much of the world, opposed the war. To its shame, it did nothing about it. Once a president does something, especially if it's under the banner of NATO, that means it is not illegal. This was effectively true when Richard Nixon said it, and has been even more true right up until the Supreme Court recently said it. You're going to hear from other speakers here about Ukraine and Gaza and the South China Sea. I want to comment briefly on Ukraine because it is the lie that half the U.S. public believes, because it is the foundation of support for NATO, because in one of the weirdest developments that I can recall, it is in the U.S. and in Europe, in our politics, right-wing, racist, militarist, fascistic figures who are most open to ending this particular war, albeit in order to focus on other wars. The facts suggest that Ukraine is harmed, not helped, by endless weapons shipments. In December of 2021, Russia proposed an agreement focused on Ukraine not joining NATO, and the U.S. rejected it. The criminal, murderous, inexcusable Russian invasion that followed was motivated, according to the Secretary General of NATO, by NATO's refusal to exclude Ukraine. Just after the invasion, in March 2022, after negotiations mediated by Turkey, it appeared that Russia was ready to withdraw from Ukraine if Ukraine would commit to not joining NATO, and that Ukraine was prepared to agree. We'll never know for sure, but we do know that well-sourced news reports show that the US and the UK told Ukraine to refuse the deal and keep the war going. Even now, after all the slaughter and destruction, the US could allow Ukraine to sit down and negotiate with Russia, could indicate that there's a limit to the supply of free weapons. But the Secretary General of NATO has publicly told the US government to allow Ukraine to use U.S. weapons to attack inside Russia, and the U.S. government has agreed. The plan is escalation, not negotiation. NATO bragged last year that it had trained 800 Ukrainians to be as corruption-free as a U.S. politician. And yet, after dumping unlimited, unaccountable weapons and dollars into the place and insisting on war for years, who knows how this came about, but Ukraine is still corrupt. And NATO says it's too corrupt for NATO. Or rather, NATO still can't corrupt all of its members into inviting Ukraine to join it. But it can move many of them to make bilateral commitments to Ukraine. It can militarize the whole damn region, and it can prepare the West culturally for World War III. After all, how much preparation do you need to say goodbye to everything? When top scientists and observers keep warning that we are closer than ever to a nuclear war, to a threat to all life on Earth, whatever one does to increase that risk makes one an opponent of humanity. While Ukrainians and Russians are exactly as valuable as everyone else, most everyone else gets forgotten and treated as worthless if we consider a nuclear-risking war in only local terms. What happens in Ukraine does not stay in Ukraine. NATO calls itself a nuclear alliance. It maintains a nuclear planning group for all of its members, those with and without nuclear weapons, to discuss the launching of the sort of war that puts all life on Earth at risk, and to coordinate rehearsals or war games, practicing for the use of nuclear weapons in Europe, where the U.S. uses NATO as cover to illegally proliferate nuclear weapons to 6 nations, and Russia now follows suit. We are in trouble and need a radical reversal, not because NATO is a good idea that's gone bad, not because NATO could be a good idea if some other countries did it, not because NATO must be a good idea because we imagine, rightly or wrongly, that certain odious individuals oppose it for their own quirky reasons, but because the enemy of life on Earth is the institutionalization of war, the establishment, normalization, and acceptance of mass murder as a public service. On this 4th of July weekend, let us recall that the United States was born out of war, a war for power, empire, and slavery, as well as for limited freedoms for a limited number of people. There have been few moments of peace for the US military ever since. Nations that lend their names and their respectability to a war addict are not its friends. The friendly thing to do would be to cut it off and take an independent stand for peace.
Thank you so much, David, providing a really comprehensive overview of all of the excuses that NATO uses. If we put these all down on a piece of paper, the gaslighting there, it's really just, it's incredible. We do have now Mutaz Salim has arrived, so I wanted to briefly introduce him again, and then we can give him a round of applause for being here as well. Mutaz Salim is a Palestinian American who is working with Code Pink. He's from Gaza and has been advocating for an end to the genocide and a free Palestine. He has been every day for 3 months. I don't know if this is up to date now, maybe it's been even more months, but in the halls of Congress lobbying. So a big round of applause for Mutaz. I think according to the schedule, though, first we will come to Alain Roy from France, who will give us a presentation on the NATO wars in Europe.
Yes, I have to apologize for my bad English. I am a teacher in France, but I teach German, not English. And I have to speak English, not German. Okay. I would like to give you a French voice on NATO. I am from the French Mouvement de la Paix, and I am also IPB Vice President. In France, as I said yesterday, NATO has never been very popular because USA, which dominates this military alliance, respects neither the diplomatic nor the military autonomy of the member states. That's why in 1966, the president of the French Republic, Charles de Gaulle, decided to withdraw France from the integrated military structures and to close the US military bases in France. That's why you have it in Belgium now. De Gaulle did not dispute the existence of the Atlantic Alliance, and he had always been a loyal ally of the United States in times of East-West crisis. But de Gaulle contested the determining weight of the USA in the integrated military command at the service of the American policy of hegemony. De Gaulle was opposed to bloc politics. He refused to alienate member states to the will and to the interests of the United States. After de Gaulle, other French presidents have also opposed NATO's orientations. President François Mitterrand contested the American conception of global security assured by NATO. and Mitterrand questioned NATO's role after the end of the USSR. President Jacques Chirac criticized NATO's evolution toward a broader alliance engaged in military intervention, a NATO that presents itself in Kosovo or in Afghanistan as a kind of armored arm of the UN, which France totally rejects. Logically, in 2003, Jacques Chirac announced that he would veto any UN resolution authorizing war against Iraq. And he did it. The fears and the criticism expressed by French presidents in the days would be even more justified today. Global NATO is no longer a defensive military alliance, but an offensive alliance at the service of the Western powers, and first and foremost at the service of the United States. Unfortunately, since President Sarkozy, successive presidents have broken with the tradition of the independence of French policy. France has re-entered NATO's integrated command. France is systematically aligning itself with US policy, and now the actual president, Emmanuel Macron, is calling those who won't help Ukraine fight to military victory, he calls them cowards. He said that. Macron. Before Macron became one of the most aggressive leaders in the Western camp, French diplomacy had played a positive role in recognizing that Russian demands for security guarantees had to be taken into account. It was the case for the Minsk agreements in 2014 and 2015, the Minsk agreements for which France was a guarantor along with Germany. It was against the positive role was against the case in February 2024, yes, when Macron maintained at the beginning contact with Putin, and he spoke from security guarantees for Russia. But now we heard something else. He wants support Ukraine till the victory, he said, and he forgets that the war in Ukraine didn't start in February 2022 with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Putin's illegal and criminal invasion is the culmination of a conflict that began with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Like Mikhail Gorbachev, we might have believed that a new era was possible. A new era was about to begin, an era of collective security and cooperation. But this was not the case. The West proclaimed its victory. The West wanted to extend its economic system to the whole planet. And to this aim, it maintained, it enlarged, and it strengthened NATO. NATO is the US's real armored arm on the whole planet. This is the context in which the war in Ukraine must be analyzed. Russia feels threatened by Western expansion, and Russia sets a red line. Ukraine must not join NATO. To reach that, Putin, the nationalist Putin, believed only in force, in invasion, in military means, and he deliberately violated the United Nations Charter. But in the end, this war will benefit NATO. NATO welcomed Finland and Sweden as new members on Russia's borders. NATO increased its hold on the European Union, as Rainer said tomorrow, yes? No, today, at the morning. And NATO can now focus on its expansion into Asia. Today, NATO is fanning the flames of conflict and has no interest in negotiating an end to the war in Ukraine. You said it, David, and it's true. In NATO's bloc logic, confrontation and expansion are more important than peace efforts. NATO means never-ending militarization of the international relations. Yet we know that the foundations for an agreement to put an end to the war in Ukraine exist. They were already laid down in the Minsk agreements, and they were still being formulated during the negotiations in Turkey in March 2022, as David reminded us. These bases for an agreement include the neutrality of Ukraine, the self-determination for the populations of Crimea and Donbass, and security agreements guaranteed by the international community. NATO countries have pushed Ukraine to reject such agreements and interrupt all negotiations. For NATO, the only valid notion of security is security by force and military supremacy. That's why NATO cannot be a force for peace, neither in Ukraine nor anywhere else in the world. The war in Ukraine has become one of the NATO's confrontation with those designated as systemic rivals in the NATO 2030 strategic documents. China and Russia are designated as systemic rivals. Rivals. These orientations cannot bring greater security to the world. On the contrary, they make NATO a factor of aggravated insecurity. We must oppose this global NATO with all our energy, which is why we hold counter summits and demonstrations every year at the times of NATO summits. We must also develop alternatives to NATO, and we have to reprioritize the notion of common security. Rehabilitate the notion of common security. In France is currently going through a very dangerous period till Sunday, until the coming months, I think, because we have the risk of the extreme right coming to power. But we are not resigning ourselves, and we appreciate that the ideas of the pacifists inspire the force of progress. It will be too short to have a victory for this force, I think, but we can impeach the extreme right to come to the power, I think. And we are happy that the French progressive forces are reviving the tradition of independent diplomacy and the tradition of peace politics for France, it means breaking free from the NATO straitjacket. France could become again a force for peace and disarmament in the service of social and climate justice. That's why I hope, and we can all hope for our country in the coming days. We know there is no justice without peace, no peace without justice. So we say no to NATO, no to the war. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alain, for the French perspective, especially into NATO's wars in Europe. I'm hoping maybe during the question and answer we'll also have some time to discuss France's role in Africa and how NATO has played into that. So hopefully we can come a bit more into that too. But for now, we will move to Motaz to come to the stage and speak about NATO's role, particularly in the Middle East.
Hello, everyone. So, NATO in the Middle East. Where do we begin? I'll start off with Palestine, because that's kind of, we usually refer to Gaza and what's happening in Gaza as the tip of the spear of imperialism, which is essentially, as far as I'm concerned, NATO's primary role as an organization is to further Western, European, US-dominated imperialism and to continue to influence other regions in the world, typically through force, through military supremacy. And so just to start off, I guess I'll give a little bit, I always like to center, especially when I speak, back to Palestine, and then we can talk more about the Middle East as a whole and how it's influenced the Middle East. So Palestine currently, over 40,000 individuals have been murdered by the Israeli state and government and the Israeli occupation forces. We've seen, especially in the last couple of months, more and more egregious war crimes being uncovered, war crimes that, by the way, Palestinians have been reporting for, since October and before October, but now we're seeing them being uncovered by all these Western outlets as well, which finally decided to conduct an investigation or two while they also justify the genocide. And just to highlight some of those, and to later I'll sort of tie it back into why this whole idea of NATO and the military supremacy is so depraved, honestly. So there have been, I don't know the exact number of mass graves uncovered in Palestine, but I know of at least 5 or 6 mass graves of over 100, 150 people uncovered underneath hospitals, such as the El Shifa hospital. And there's also been many reports about the, I'm going to call them what they are. They're essentially concentration camps and torture camps that have been specifically created to subjugate the Palestinian population, humiliate them, torture them, and ultimately either murder them or drive them out. So, and a very clear example of that is, I don't know how to pronounce it exactly, this Sde Tideman camp, which has had a lot of reporting about it because CNN, again, one time decided to do an investigation like 3 months, 4 months after many Palestinian journalists and journalists in the region were trying to get the world to pay attention to it. So that's kind of the price that's been paid so far. But what I will also say is that Palestine has also shown us how, I mean, the Zionist state, Israel, always tries to present itself, and it's done so successfully for most of its history, as impenetrable, almost like an invincible state that there's no way to kind of counter it, there's no way to resist it, there's no way to fight it. And what Palestine and Gaza specifically has shown us is that this is an outright lie, a very well-constructed lie to try and even discourage people from even considering the fact that the Israeli state can be resisted, can be, there can be an end to the genocide and the depraved war crimes that it has committed for 9 months now and for 75 plus years before that. So I'll start off by kind of talking about a little bit, as if I didn't start off already. Sort of talk about in a more, I guess, geopolitical context of NATO's involvement in the Middle East, which doesn't get a lot of media coverage for, you can guess what the reasons are. NATO does really have like good PR in the sense that like, because it's not such a, especially in the Middle East, you know, there's not like a very formal like NATO presence, formal meaning like NATO doesn't really go, like the General Secretary doesn't go and visit many of the states except for recently, they've been starting to, and that kind of allows them a cover to not be targeted as NATO. But anyways, so NATO recently, I believe almost 2 years ago, launched what's called the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, which essentially was an effort to bolster its ties with some of the Gulf states, such as the UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, and it's essentially an initiative to kind of bolster military relations, because at the end of the day, that's NATO's primary way of conducting quote-unquote diplomacy is through military supremacy and bolstering the military capabilities of the actors that it cooperates with in the region. It also expanded what's called its Mediterranean dialogue to facilitate political dialogue with Middle Eastern countries such as Egypt and Jordan as well. And it's also played a very vital role in a lot of the normalization ties that came out of the Abraham Accords. And NATO's kind of been on the ground ensuring that these, like the normalization such as from Jordan, Bahrain, Morocco as well, is incentivized. So if you sort of toe the line, follow what the US and by the extension the Western nations in Europe and NATO tell you to do, all of a sudden you have brand new fighter jets and brand new anti-air defense missiles and brand new tanks and whatever. Maybe that's too literal, like I'm being maybe hyperbolic a little bit, but also maybe not. I don't have exact stats for you for what weapons NATO has facilitated in the region, but you get the general idea. And so that's to present you a very clear, direct example of how we've seen sort of NATO's work in the Middle East show up recently in relation to Palestine. For one, early on in the Israeli genocide of Gaza and the Israeli offensive on Gaza and the West Bank and now southern Lebanon as well, the US deployed a lot of its super high-tech, like the air carriers and a lot of its ships from its navy. But it wasn't the US alone. Other Western nations have also been found to have sent some of their ships, as well as doing, the Air Force will always just like kind of take over the airspace nearby that they can, just to always provide this sort of intimidation to the regional actors that they oppose. It was very clearly seen when, well, first I'll talk about sort of the Houthi blockade. So the Houthis, or Ansar Allah in Yemen, have essentially created a blockade in the Red Sea. So any ship that has any sort of ties to Israel or plans to dock in Israel or is shipping from or to Israel, they've essentially targeted in a variety of ways. Shout out Yemen. And so I actually like the Houthi example, I think is telling of it's for me, I like to view it as an optimistic example of the limitations of NATO and the fact that Palestine and the whole Palestinian cause and movement and resistance against occupation has kind of shown us that NATO and the powers, Western powers, I like how this put it, the axis of domination, is actually penetrable. It is, you are able to inflict damage to it, you are able to resist it, and I think that's telling of a longer road to try and bring an end to this axis of domination. Because when the US, when the Houthis first started their initiative in the Red Sea, their blockade, the US scrambled to find a coalition of nations to support its counter efforts against the Houthis in the Red Sea. And a lot of nations refused, including Gulf nations, refused to provide ships, refused to provide resources. And it was so dire that I think it was like Seychelles that was part of that coalition. I think Seychelles was just glad to be part of any sort of, it's like, we're a world player now, I guess. Seychelles is providing a ship to go to the Red Sea to support the US coalition against the Houthis. And I think it was very telling. I mean, Bahrain, Saudi, the UAE, none of them they were like, we're gonna keep our hands off of this. And the reason I highlight those Gulf Arab nations specifically is because that's kind of been the primary, those have been the primary allies of NATO in the region. And there's been talk before about this idea of a Middle East NATO, which a lot of Western outlets insist it's not actually happening. You know, Israel really wants it, but the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, we don't want to impose our sort of Western imperial influence on them. But the reality is, we saw that, you know, Middle East NATO is not a very formalized thing yet, but we did actually see it effectively in action when Iran sent that barrage of missiles and drones to strike Israel in response to Israel striking its embassy in Syria. We saw that Israel was not actually able on its own to completely defend against that attack. They had to recruit the help of Jordan. They had to recruit the help of intelligence from the US, from other European nations, from Saudi as well. And that example for me shows us the full picture of what NATO does, even if it's not been fully formalized yet into a organization that's called the Middle Eastern NATO, or whatever they want to call it. It's already here. It already exists. The fact that Jordan was shooting down drones or missiles headed towards the state that is currently murdering Palestinians en masse is telling of how horrible NATO is as an organizing body, because all it does is essentially allow, especially in Palestine, it's been a key player in defending the genocide, facilitating the continuation of the genocide, and also imposing sanctions, for example, against Iran and other actors in the region. And it's using like all its power to put down any sort of resistance against the genocide, which is by international humanitarian law allowed. I mean, it's not just allowed, it should be encouraged, if anything. And yet we see NATO, which someone essentially, like, it frames itself as like the military arm of the UN, is actually facilitating the continuation of this genocide and disallowing any efforts to end it. So there was a quote I saw from German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, who said that Iran must be isolated when they conducted their attack on Israel, because, quote unquote, because of course there must be a reaction to this unprecedented incident. But there must be no further escalation in the region. Unprecedented incident. They sent like a few hundred missiles that mainly hit like military targets in the desert. That's unprecedented. Meanwhile, Israel bombarding Palestinian civilians in Gaza, detaining people unlawfully in the West Bank, destroying the local agriculture and local land and the sources of life in the land in the south of Lebanon, in Palestine. That's not unprecedented. That is not an escalation. But in fact, this one act that did not cause that much material damage to the Israeli state is called an unprecedented incident. I get really frustrated when I talk about NATO because it's, again, it has really good PR and people are like, yeah, but it's kind of just like a cooperation of nations, peacekeeping, la-di-da. They're partially responsible for the genocide of Gaza, of Palestinians. NATO is responsible in part for the genocide in Palestine. Let's be very clear about that. Let's be very clear about that. And the most insidious way that it is responsible is by essentially coaxing all these Gulf Arab states, Jordan, Morocco. You know, in the Arab world, we always mock our leaders because most of them are cowards. And a big part of the reason for that is that NATO has just exerted its influence in such a egregious, hegemonic way on the region that the calculation has become for a lot of Arab leaders is, okay, we can either like stand up for what we truly believe in, for our culture, our heritage, our dignity, our people in Palestine, and for the Ummah, if you're not aware, you know, and it's like a concept in Islam of like, Muslims are kin to one another no matter what. Anytime you come across another Muslim, like they are your kin. You are supposed to be one unified nation, essentially, against any sort of aggression imposed on any of our people. And so there's this hypocrisy now where you have these Muslim states, almost like states where the politics are very much tied in with the theology, that have completely abandoned those ideals, abandoned Palestine, and instead have said our way forward, our way to ensure our safety is to essentially stand down, take what NATO gives us and cooperate with NATO and the Western nations and the US. And if Palestine goes, then it goes. That's essentially a big part of what NATO has done. It's subjugated these nations to its will, to the will of the Western imperialist nations, and now, unfortunately, Palestine is the one that has to suffer. Because the reality is, all these nations with their capabilities could bring an end to the genocide. They could, but they choose not to. They choose not to because they would rather maximize their profits, bolster their defense, and watch Palestine be genocided. It's pretty dire, but I will sort of, to end, kind of bring it back to a more hopeful message, which Gaza, as the tip of the spear of imperialism, as kind of the main, NATO's doing a lot of stuff all over the place, but especially in Gaza, like we've seen just how horrific, or rather Gaza has shown us how horrific this imperialism is, this just egregious militarism and, conducting efforts through military power and just, it's shown us how awful that is. But it's also shown us that it's penetrable, it can be destroyed, it can be resisted, and it will be, because Gaza has resisted. Despite everything, Gaza has resisted, and Gaza still lives. Still lives. And more so than that too, Israel is losing. They are. Israel is losing. The war has been an absolute disaster to their economy. You even see like European nations sort of starting to back off bit by bit, saying, okay, no, we actually do want to see Palestinian statehood. Israel should calm the heck down and stop committing these war crimes. And I think that's very telling. That's a big part of that is the work we've done too, as people on the ground, pressing the issue every day, day after day, month after month, despite burnout, despite the anguish. Israel is losing its allies. It's losing the war on a military basis, which it makes up for by murdering another dozen civilians every day. And NATO is a big part of what allows Israel to continue its genocide, but it's losing, and NATO is also starting to become more and more exposed. And inshallah, like, we'll see a free Palestine, and we'll see an end to this axis of domination by NATO. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Motaz, for your bravery and your courage in this, for being so active despite, as you said, the burnout, the stress that all of this causes. To be able to continue it forward is something that is so inspiring for so many of us. And I see your videos from where I work out in Berlin, and it gives me courage and energy as well. So we're really happy to have you with us today and to share all that you've shared with us. One quick additional notes that Anne Wright had shared with me is that Israel is special in having an office in the NATO headquarters, despite, of course, not being a NATO member. And, of course, thank you as well for highlighting Germany's role in all this that has been outsized, and residing myself in Germany and seeing this, I hope we can build some cross-border solidarity between the great peace activists also working in Germany to make this effort stronger altogether. We have one more speaker now, and we're just getting the final text set up for it. I think it was on the screen a second ago. I'm not sure. Yeah. let's set it up down here, and then let's see.
Maybe if I turn it off again. It was on a minute ago. Try speaking also while we're.
Yeah, it's still coming through the computer for the speaking, I think.
Okay. Oh, there it goes.
Perfect. All right, let's see if the sound is working on there for him.
Keep speaking if you would.
No, I
Speak
think-
up a little more. We may have to use that microphone.
Let me see.
Can you hear me if I speak like this?
Give us one more second. System, let's try this one, HDMI.
Yeah.
Can you try again?
Okay, can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yes. Oh,
And speak up a lot.
yeah.
Okay, so I could speak like this? Yeah? More? That's the maximum.
Okay, we're back. Francis Dae-Hoon Lee has been a professor for peace studies at the Song Kong Ho University, Ritsumeikan University, and the International University of Japan. He served as a legal advisor to the Special Rapporteur of UN Human Rights Subcommission in 2005 and worked for the Center for Peace Museum in Korea. He has a long and full career here. I could read you the whole thing. More is available on the website, but I'd like to give him the floor. So Francis, please go ahead. We're happy to hear you. Thanks.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, organizers, for organizing this conference and giving me opportunity to speak in this session. I'm Francis Lee, based in Seoul, South Korea, and I work with a group called Peace Momo. I hope everybody can hear this clearly. Yes. I'm now going, yes? Okay, I'm going to speak about an urge for conflict prevention and common security vision in Northeast Asia in relation to preventing NATO expansion. I've been seeing huge changes in military security landscape in East Asia continuously since the time of Obama, but most significantly since 2022. With the war in Ukraine, but more changes in East Asia at the same time, especially South Korea and Japan. There's a huge change. Recently, all countries in Northeast Asia are undergoing one of the highest levels of military buildup and highest level of joint military exercises. Diplomacy and dialogues are gone. Hostilities are growing fast. There is obviously mutual escalation running into a clash in my mind. The crucial beginning in East Asia from the US is actually from Obama's time, pivot to Asia rebalancing. In terms of securitization, militarization, things have been changing and then speeded up with the so-called Indo-Pacific strategy by Trump administration. Indo-Pacific, it was the first time to hear this very strange formulation, Indo-Pacific, for the first time. Now, China, Russia, and North Korea didn't sit still. They reacted against such US actions fast and very strongly. The situation is now very worrisome. I plead to you that this is very, very worrying situation in East Asia. Let's look at South Korea first. Since 2022, we have a new government, very hawkish, and they've been cooperating with the US-led anti-China, anti-Russia military alliances very actively. This new Yoon government declared the full intention to confront North Korea with military force and aim for regime collapse, which is highly provocative to the government in DPRK. South Korea now repeats stronger alliance and cooperation scenarios with the US, with Japan, and with NATO. Peace through strength is now President's most favorite saying. South Korea's new deterrence initiatives are something that we need to watch carefully. South Korea and Japan, when they join US deterrence and militarizing actions, they are rich and they have huge military facilities and manpower. Since 2022, the change in South Korea was evident during the unusually prolonged and repeated joint military exercises between the US and South Korea, as well as US, Japan, and South Korea. And these military exercises, I would like to call war exercises, they are going almost every day throughout the whole year. And NATO countries from Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Southeast Asian countries, Indonesia, Philippines, they join in these joint military exercises. And now it is East Asia, which is full of everyday multilateral military exercises. For example, 3 years ago, we saw 256 joint military exercises in and near South Korea alone. And some of those exercises included, quote and unquote, decapitation operation training, which is a de facto preemptive strategy to remove enemy's leadership and key assets. To some, this is almost a war breakout situation. In Japan, there is worrisome changes since 2022 too. Japan announced a plan to increase its defense spending by 2% of GDP from 2023 for the next 5 years. It is aiming to double its defense budget by year 2027. And this will make Japan world number 3 military spender. And they are now in deep military alliance with US, and also they are invited to NATO summit this week. And then Japan revised key security policies, specifying for the first time after the Second World War that it should have counterattack capabilities, and it clearly identified China and DPRK as major threats. And immediately after that, they began negotiations to purchase from 400 to 600 Tomahawk missiles from Japan. And these missiles are capable of hitting mainland China and Beijing included. And in response, North Korea launched more missiles and rockets than ever before. And crucially, in September 2022, I think we should remember this change in North Korea. They formalized the use of nuclear weapons into the law, stating that it would immediately launch nuclear strike if its leadership or military command were under threat. And now, just a few kilometers across the border from DPRK, there is a joint military exercises going on almost every day. In Camp David, the 3 governments call it as a military or security cooperation, but they emerged with a de facto military alliance of 3 countries, and this is for the first time that is happening among South Korea and Japan and the US. I hope you imagine their military budget and their military capabilities and all the exercises they have gone through in terms of war readiness. As a consequence, nuclear armament talks began to surface in South Korea. In January 2023, President Yoon raised regional tension by saying if North Korean nuclear issue worsens, South Korea may deploy tactical nuclear weapons or even possesses its own nuclear weapons. Now this may is now changing will and should in the South Korean conservative politics. South Korea is now fully in for the US-led extended deterrence with what they call the Korean 3-axis system. This is almost a massive first strike and preemptive strike. And South Korea has some 500,000 strong standing army and more than 1 million reserve army. In response, North Korea held a summit with Russia twice since last year and signed a pact about 3 weeks ago that includes mutual defense, or to be more exact, collective security arrangement. This is for the first time since the Cold War time. We will see North Korea more visible and Russia more active in East Asia because of this pact. So what can we see from these changes? A grid of offensive alliances being realized here in Northeast Asia, the fastest. The fact is that the bilateral alliances maintained by the United States in each regions of the world is not only deepening and developing, but more closely connecting to the entire globe and space. The US-led East Asian alliance system is being reorganized at a rapid pace and orchestrated to a dangerous level. We need rethinking. We need new actions on the US alliance orchestration. Second, new relationships are forming among US alliance partners, such as Philippines, Japan, Australia, Japan, ROK, South Korea. Various small-scale cooperation between the so-called like-minded countries, such as Australia, Korea, and Japan, are constantly emphasized. We must say that the alliance system limited to East Asia is now closely connected to the security structure of Europe and the entire world. With South Korea providing weapons to Ukraine and North Korea beginning to provide arms to Russia, the Ukraine war, for example, the Ukraine war marked the beginning of unifying security horizons of both sides of Eurasia. They are not separated. NATO has invited 4 Asian countries, South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, to the summit since 3 years ago, and at the same time, they issued a strategic concept document stating China is a systemic threat, and China is located in Asia. NATO confronts China, and this is a fact. This means NATO will come or has already come to Asia. And there is an agenda in NATO meeting to establish NATO office in Tokyo. So I note that the way that the US is strengthening security relationship with its partner countries resembles her behavior just after the Second World War. Please remember that Truman government pursued a US-led global governing global domination by establishing a multilateral alliance in Europe, NATO, and a spoke-style bilateral alliance network in Asia. And that is now happening again. What if this situation is not stopped? As weapons and troops are flooding in, hostilities are rising fast, incompetent leaders are taking over, nations are divided into blocs, the military alliances are flourishing. What will happen? I think we should anticipate the worst. Along that, we should anticipate big failure. If we cannot prevent the enormous waste of that created by arms race at the time of climate crisis, I think it is more than a regional crisis. I think it is more than a local armed conflict or war. It is very seriously more than that. So I'm really concerned. The hegemonic politics of securitization and bad leadership will explode into flames not very far from now. We must really worry about a bigger catastrophe that will follow if we fail to stop this confrontation in the Asia-Pacific. Likewise, we need to shift our focus of envisioning peace and peace building to new agenda. I'd like to advocate that we should formulate new agenda so that we can act on new fronts. In Asia, Northeast Asia in particular, there are now urgent needs for early warning from every sector against possible armed conflict. And new diplomacy is necessary for changes in the regional security structure in order to establish a regional common security system. I think this is time that we should work step by step to establish common security regime. And my final plea is that common security starts by listening to and paying respect to security needs of all the parties involved in the region, face to face. That's the first thing. So therefore, what stands in front of us is not only denial of common security approach and respect of all sovereign states, it's a confrontational and aggressive, active, planned move of almost all Northeast Asian countries, and especially on this side, orchestrated by the US. The NATO as the name does not exist yet in Northeast Asia, but the essence and the real militarized activities for NATO exist in Northeast Asia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francis. And first, just to give Francis an extra thanks because he is awake right now. It is 2 a.m. in South Korea, and he stayed awake just for this. Briefly also say, a couple of the presenters in this session have mentioned the concept of common security. It is something I think many people may not be familiar with. We have some handouts with a QR code that are towards the entrance. If anyone is interested, there's a report that we worked on in 2022 where you can find out more information. Also, several people who are with us here today, including Francis, Joseph Gerson, who's back there, Rainer Braun, who is in the last panel, and some others are currently working on a report specifically on common security in East Asia, and we're hoping that will be out later this year, so please, you can follow along with that process if you'd like to learn more. So thank you again, Francis. We have, I think, still about 15 minutes here for a Q&A before we break for lunch. So I would open up the floor for questions. I see there's already a hand here. I'm going to try my best. I'm sure there's a lot. I think we're going to take maybe 3 questions, and then we'll give the floor for answers. So yes, please, go ahead. I don't know where a microphone is right now. I think it's coming from back there.
We've been having a monthly vigil at the home of Merrick Garland, who's the key decision maker for the Assange case. And every month, a number of us were there across from his house and helped to move the needle on that. And we're going to have a final vigil tomorrow at 4, which is after the rally. So I just wanted to announce that everyone's welcome to come up to Bethesda. It's right near the Bethesda Metro, and join us in front of Merrick Garland's home, 4 p.m. But there is a question there for you. How did Julian confronted Empire, and he got out information that they didn't want to get out. So how can we continue that work of getting the information and so people can decide what their policy should be? Thank you.
Yeah, I think we'll take 2 more questions. Anyone else have questions? I see one over here. And then, sorry, there's also some over here.
Okay, so there are a lot of questions because these presentations are very good. I would like to ask what's happening in Europe and what are the meaning of EU elections, of the elections coming up in different countries, of the move in Europe toward the right. In the past, we would always feel, oh, good, we held off the right wing and the good guys in EU are winning. And that process is over, and we've seen these good guys in Europe being transformed into very bad guys. What are your feelings about the developments in Europe at this time?
Actually, can I cheat? I had a couple of questions. Sure. One is related to the question that was just asked. So in Europe, I guess my question would be, to what extent have all the pro-Palestinian movements contributed to what's going on with the alleged rise of the far right? Because pro-Palestinian demonstrations are always mischaracterized as pro-Hamas, pro-terrorism, the same talking points that are used here. That's question number 1. And question number 2, I guess this is more speculation, but Gaza has has essentially been rendered unlivable. It's not only a pile of rubble. People don't really have homes to go back to, even though we keep saying that as part of any ceasefire, people have to return home. But the damage done to the land itself has rendered Gaza unlivable. So this is maybe just a speculative question. I had read somewhere that there was originally a plan for a canal that was proposed back in the 60s, the Ben Gurion Canal, cutting through Gaza. Does the situation in Gaza now further give credence to that potential for Gaza, especially given the Houthi blockade? That could be used as justification to need another shipping route.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's our 3 questions. Oh, are we taking one more? Yeah. One more, okay.
This is really easy. It's just a comment. It's an announcement, actually. I just want you all to know that I have stamps made out of sponges, and it says no to NATO, yes to peace, and so on and so forth in different colors. And if you want it on your stuff, on your back, on your pads, on your butt, whatever, you can come over and we can do it together. The other thing is, as far as Europe goes, the PTB is the only party in Belgium that has consistently been against NATO forever. And we're a national party, and we've done great advancements.
Thank you. So I think we'll just give all speakers a chance to respond here. And unfortunately, that might be the end of our time for the session. But David, please go ahead.
Julian Assange being free at last, thank goodness. I think it's important that the lesson be for the public, not that the bastards coerced him into a false confession and that the law is now stronger, but that they don't drop cases unless they know the cases are no good. And they didn't have a case, and that's why they had to drop it. And they should never try this nonsense again, because they still won't have a case. And that there are journalists and whistleblowers still in prison, threatened with prison, and being killed, especially in Palestine, by the dozens. And we need to be promoting their work, supporting them, demanding protections for them, for their lives as well as their freedom. And the people quitting the U.S. government by the dozens, but still a tiny, tiny percentage of the people who should be quitting the U.S. government are also saying things that need to be said. And we need to make their voices heard, celebrate them, belated and limited as it might be, in order to encourage more of their colleagues to do the same. We need to be promoting all of these whistleblowers, no matter what horrors they did up until this moment when they become whistleblowers. I do think it's a little odd to claim that we have a rally and call it pro-Palestine, and then they say it's pro-Hamas. Call it pro-peace. Call it pro-humanity. You're just helping them out. It's not. They don't have to take a very big step from pro-Palestine to pro-Hamas, and you know they're going to do it. Don't help them. And I think the rise of the right can hardly be attributed to people demanding peace in Palestine. I think it's mostly attributable to people's own selfish lives getting worse, and getting worse because members of all political parties and persuasions are dumping all of their hard-earned money into the wars that are killing the people over in Palestine. So I think we need to be shifting the politics to an understanding that the amount of money that's going into these absolute horrors is enough to transform the lives of everybody, locally where you are and in distant lands. There's no need to split your interests. There's no need to care. We want to make the world better for Palestinians or for Belgians. It's everybody. The money is unimaginably huge. We can make the world a better place. Down the street in Washington, D.C., where people have nothing to eat and nowhere to sleep, and in Palestine, and have more money left over than we can figure out what to do with if we take it out of the war machine. Yes, of course they have horrific plans for pipelines and canals and selling beachfront property and all the rest of it, and we have to expose it and stop it. Thank you.
I'll add some thoughts to some of the questions. I think for the first question regarding like how, regarding Julian Assange and, you know, getting information, I think what I want to point out is my biggest takeaway from what Julian did is that it took a lot of risk and it took a lot of sacrifice that it shouldn't be such a big sacrifice to actually expose what the world leaders are doing, things that they don't want to get out. And that's kind of been, you know, I remember when WikiLeaks like first really came onto the scene, and at first there was sort of this, the way I saw it at least is like the discourse and the general opinion about WikiLeaks was very positive from the majority of people, even in you know, centrist liberal political talking heads and whatnot. But then they started, you know, WikiLeaks started going for everyone in power who was, you know, had things to hide and had lies that they were keeping away from the public that were damaging the public. And that's when you sort of saw the discourse in the media especially change to a more like demonizing of WikiLeaks and Julian. And it's still kind of the case with whistleblowers. Any reporting I see about whistleblowers that are still in jail, it's always sort of, it tries to take like a neutral stance. And I think my big takeaway from that is we need to abandon this neutral stance that if, I don't know if people here have this ideology, so to speak, but whistleblowers are heroes. I mean, the sacrifice, like the fact that Julian Assange has spent, you know, longer than a decade even, from, you know, being in the Ecuadorian embassy, being moved around, spending 5+ years in jail. It's a farce. I mean, this guy, essentially what he did is create an organization that exposed much of what we already knew as people who are for peace. And, you know, we're always called like conspiracy theorists for being against the war machine that ultimately controls a lot of the ways that states act and behave, and that's why we don't have things like healthcare and, you know, resources for our own local communities, because we'd rather bomb my cousins in Gaza. And so I like to finish off with that question. I will say that the way we can find out more about is to, you have to do your own research and find these sources. And I would also encourage people on a more general, in a more like philosophical sense, like consider how much risk that takes and how much risk we have to take, each and every one of us. Because being a whistleblower, I mean, Julian's life was essentially put on hold for 15 years or so. That's an insane thing. That's almost like a fifth of a lifetime. But that's unfortunately sometimes what it takes. Not to, you know, give any credit to what they did to him, but we are fighting a very like depraved system, and that is very telling that all he did was expose some of it and had to bear like the worst of the worst from it. In regards to the question about Palestine protests and tying that in with the rise of the right, I don't really think, I think you put it really well about, it's more so the other political factions that are supposed to be the quote unquote good guys have fully like invested themselves in the militarism, in the war machine as well. All that money that is promised to the local communities for local infrastructure, what have you, is instead being spent on fighting foreign wars to exert influence to quote-unquote security. And I don't think there's really any direct sort of pro-Palestine or like the Palestinian movement to the rise of the right. I think if anything, it's used as an excuse or a scapegoat, because what it does, if anything, is reveal a lot of the hatred and ideological depravity that a lot of the right-wing groups have, where the fact that there is a Palestinian movement emboldens them to be more aggressive and more racist and more disgusting in the way they conduct not only their politics, but their day-to-day lives. And so yeah, and honestly, even if like to the comment about like the language of pro-Palestine versus pro-humanity or pro-peace, no matter what we frame it as, the right wing is gonna call us terrorists or terrorist sympathizers or whatever. I don't think that's, I think if anything, we press the issue harder and insist on fighting whatever narrative the right wing creates, and we press our own narrative and what we feel is right, which is right. And okay, my bad. We're out of time, so I can keep yapping forever if you want to talk to me after. But
Allô, 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 non, ça marche pas. Allô, si maintenant. The first question, what is happening in Europe, I think it's a result of the economic and social order of the model of neoliberalism. It has catastrophic consequences for the people. The people are poorer, and we are economic powers, France, Germany, and other countries, and we have a very big lot of the population which is poor, and the people with a job, they cannot pay their lodging and so on. It's desperation for a lot of people, and desperation is absolutely not good in politics. And the people says, well, we can try with new politicians, with extreme right. We didn't try them. Why not? And it will be, of course, it will be worse with them, because the economic power is responsible for this situation, but it can take benefit from the extreme right wing, because against the trade unions, against our freedom and so on. And it's a very bad situation, and the progressive forces they failed to bring alternatives. The French socialist president François Hollande was worse than the right, that the conservative, that Chirac, for example, yes. And without alternative, it's a good possibility for extreme right wing. For Palestine, yes, in France, we had to face a very big propaganda of Jews extremist organizations very close to Netanyahu and to the racist government of Israel. But now it is changing, the reality of the genocide, and now the reality of the colonialism in the West Bank. It's officially authorized that yesterday. The people, they understand. We have 3 EU countries They have recognized the Palestinian state. I think that France can do it, perhaps in coming months, and we hope that France can be active in the EU for the suspending of the commercial agreements with Israel, between Israel and EU. It will be difficult, but we can have a majority in Europe for that.
I don't really have time for closing remarks, but I want to thank all of our speakers again for excellent contributions. Big round of applause. And of course, they will all stick around, I think, for some time here, so hopefully we'll be able to have some further discussions with them today and hopefully also tomorrow. Before we stand up, Anne Wright has an announcement about lunch and how everything will go, so please listen very closely so we all get some nice lunch.
Well, thank you, Sean, and thank you to this great panel. Let's give another round of applause for them. Well, we are so glad that all of you showed up and that we have food for all of you. But before we do anything, I want our baristas, Pat and Zul, to come right up here to the front. These guys, come on. These guys have brought in all the food. They brought in all the food. They've made all the coffee. It's so good to have the guys doing all of that. Yay!
Everybody, all the food is vegan. There are sandwiches and wraps and salads downstairs. Nathan, when you go out this main door that you came in, is going to direct you downstairs. You'll go into the lunchroom. Sandwich, wraps, and salads, all vegan. Desserts and beverages are here. We only have coffee, cold water, and hot water. That's up here. So there's only so much room downstairs. You can sit down or you can bring things up here. Thank you.
You want to say something? Well, again, we want to thank them for going out and getting all of this, for preparing it, and doing what guys ought to be doing all the time. So, now wait. Okay, so we have lunch now, but I'm putting a little change in the schedule. We want you back here at 2:15, not 2:30, 2:15, because we are going to show a very important documentary. This is Global Women United Against NATO, who organized last year's anti-NATO, No to NATO conference in Brussels. They have the declaration. They've got 200 women from around the world who are saying no to NATO. So we'll start that at 2:15. So come on back. Thank you.